My name is Maud Mandel. I'm the Dean of the College here at Brown and a Professor of History and Judaic Studies. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this lecture series on teaching and learning in the digital environment, which is a several session lecture series that's going to take place over the course of this semester, which will bring together expertise at Brown, expertise outside of Brown, and others to discuss some of the developments, experiments, and challenges of teaching and learning across university campuses. This event is brought to you by a group of folks here at Brown who've been working together to think about Brown's imprint in the digital landscape. Myself, Joe Mizell from the Provost's office, Harriet Hamasi from the library, Karen Sibley, who's somewhere, I saw her in the back, Ravi Penza, who's next to her. Did I leave anybody out? I think, and then several faculty members who have now joined our group as well. And we are launching the university conversation about this here today with this panel of folks at Brown who have made an imprint in this area already. So this panel today will bring together 4 Brown faculty members who have already integrated digital tools into their teaching in different ways, including the substantial inclusion of digital technology in the classroom, as well as the development of fully online and blended courses. And we're going to talk together about how this technology changed their teaching, what opportunities it provided for students, and what challenges it created for students. These 4 faculty are not the only faculty at Brown who've done this, but they are 4 who have engaged in really terrific experiments, and we look forward to hearing a bit about those experiences. So I'm going to introduce them in order of how they perhaps are sitting and not how they appeared in your program here. So closest to me, Professor Andy Van Dam, who is the Thomas J. Watson Jr. University Professor of Technology and Education and a Professor of Computer Science. Next to him is Stephen Foley, Associate Professor of English, as well as Associate Professor of Comparative Literature. And on the far end, Pedro Delbo, Associate Professor of Economics. Also joining us in a few minutes will be Gita Penza, Clinical Assistant Professor of Emergency Medicine. And before I turn this over, and I think I will just go in order of how they appear in the sheet, each person on the panel will speak to you for a few minutes about the courses they put together and the way in which they use digital technology. Then we'll have some roundtable conversation that I will moderate, and I'll leave time at the end so that you guys can ask questions about the things that interest you most about the work that these faculty have been engaged in. And so I think without further ado, Pedro Delbo, I think, is our first presenter, and will tell us a little bit about the work that he did in flipping a classroom in the econ department.
Okay, so I would like to share my experience with the redesigning of intermediate micro. So that's a class that has more or less 250 students each semester in different sections. And the digital component that we incorporated to that class had to do not so much with the need to have a digital component, but we needed the digital component to free classroom time to do other things than the usual lecture. So the traditional econ class at that level, like in this classroom, you see a lot of blackboards and are folded. Basically, you come to the class, you cover those blackboards with a lot of formulas for an hour and a half almost, and if there is a question, especially if you made a mistake, they stop you. And then you hope that all the implications of all those formulas are going to be absorbed automatically by the students. Okay, there is very little discussion in a traditional econ class at that level at the beginning of the concentration, and that has a lot of problems, resulting in the students only study for the exam, focusing too much on the formalities, on the math, too little on the econ and the implications of what we were teaching. So we wanted to change the structure of the class to have more meaningful interactions and also try to have the students studying earlier. So the digital component was a way of moving some of this very passive lecturing type to a video that the students could watch at their own time. So in the class now, if you go to the Canvas site, you have for every week a series of videos that are basically the numerical examples. So we still have a lecture in which we go over the main theory, the big picture. Then a lot of the numerical examples with the formulas, with precise examples, are in videos. And these videos help the students understand what they saw in lecture. Those videos free lecture time that then we use for something else. So the funny thing is that using a digital component was not a goal on itself, but was a way of changing how we use the face-to-face time. And so what technology can, new technology can help us change the design of the class even when you're not using the technology. Okay? So that's how the technology play a role in our class. To our surprise, the students love the videos. So now in the teaching evaluations, one of the things that students usually mention is how useful the videos were. Which is funny because once you're watching a video, you cannot ask for, if you don't understand something, you cannot stop and ask the professor for a clarification, but they can stop the video and go back. And it seems they are much more likely to do that than to stop me during lecture. So they like the fact that you can stop the video, watch it again, whenever they find it, whenever they have time. So that's how I got into this new digital technology. So for me, the benefit is clear in the sense that it allows me to re-optimize the whole design of the class and try to have the lecture time or the classroom time assigned to more interactive activities. So kind of you flip kind of the design of the class, and we use technology to allow us to do this. Possible cost. I thought I should come up with some ideas of what would be the cost. So a cost for me is something I worry about. I don't know what the evidence is that by moving to this interaction through computers, in a way we are also providing a source of distraction. I worry a little to the degree in which being always in the computer, where there is always something else to do, can have a negative impact in the focus of the students. I wonder how long is the chunk of time that they're really focusing on the class, or how often they cut their studying to go do something else online. We all know that sometimes computer can be very distracting. And the other, clearly the students love this new design, they love the videos. It makes it much easier for them to master the material. I wonder if there is some type of also long-run cost. So this is the negative view, whether there is a short-run benefit in the sense that they're learning the material in a much easier way. It's much more fun. One may worry about whether there is some type of pedagogical populism, that I make my class easier, but then the students don't learn something else, which is to sit down and spend 2 hours reading a difficult to understand book. Now we make everything so much easier to understand that maybe we are failing to teach how to suffer while learning. So that would be the downside I can imagine. Teaching evaluations increase tremendously. Satisfaction with the class, with the materials, the amount of discussion that we have in office hours especially, the students are much more engaged. So there's a big positive and maybe a negative I wanted to bring to the table.
Yes. Well, my day job is teaching Renaissance poetry, but the class that I proposed to the School of Professional Studies for the summer session when they invited proposals for online classes was a class in composition that I had taught as a young assistant professor. We all, in my generation, taught composition or expository writing, what we now call nonfiction writing at Brown. But one of the best courses I ever taught was a course in travel writing. It was called Reading, Writing, and Traveling, and it involved the reading of classic travel literature in different rhetorical modes: description, research, narrative, character study, in light of creating models for the students' own composition in those same modes. So I thought this was a natural for a summer studies online course because the students would be around the globe and the class would be would constitute laboratory conditions about writing about places for people who weren't in that place. And that, I think, really turned out very well. I worked with two designers from the School of Professional Studies, Ren Whitaker and Rebecca Taub, who are here, I think. And they really helped me conceive of how this course would work. It's a low-tech course. It's run almost entirely through Canvas, through the tools that are available on Canvas. And the difficulty for me wasn't so much the technology, it was the structure of time. I'm a pretty careful teacher. I plan my courses out. But teaching online meant that I had to think everything out in advance, and I had never, ever done that before, because there is, when you get the course going, there's room for improvising, but I really had to think about it in a way that I hadn't thought about it before. The pleasure for me in this class really has to do with the intimacy of an online community of writers. Writing classes taught on campus are also a pleasure, but the workshops where you actually discuss the students' writing are a forum that doesn't necessarily favor the introspective, neurotic personality of the good writer, who would much rather be at home and quiet than showing off in class. So an online forum of writers where the students see one another's writing, they're totally exposed to their peers, creates a community that favors the writer and not the bold and the loud. And that really is a pleasure. It also is a community where everyone has to contribute. There's no silent member in an online class. So there is, in the online format, there's simply more opportunity and daily opportunity for the students to do exercises in writing. And that, I learned from doing that kind of class that this was a format I wanted to use in my regular literature classes. So the class that I'm teaching, the two classes I'm teaching this semester, a course in poetry and the arts, and a course, an introductory course in how poems see, both of those classes require weekly online discussions where the students respond in about 250 words to a question that I posed for the week. And it means that at the beginning of every week, I come into a class of students who have done the reading and have something to say about it. And as much as I respect Brown students, that's just a little bit of a structural goad that forces a kind of participation that can slide for the best of reasons because of pressure from other classes or travel or family concerns. It just creates a certain regularity of contribution in the class that I really, really appreciate. So that's what I've learned from doing this, basically.
So, and you want to go next, and we'll let Gita join us at the table.
Would you like to go next? Or would you prefer?
Go right ahead.
Okay.
Get myself set up.
So I love what you were saying, Stephen, because I'm going to echo some of that in a much earlier experiment. But let me start off by saying that I'm a cynic about the use of educational technology, but a cynic in the sense of a frustrated idealist. I've been working in this area for over 5 decades, and we just haven't hit it yet. There are lots of experiments, and certainly our community has evolved tremendously because of the availability of the internet and word processing and so on. But it still hasn't fundamentally affected the way we do education and learning. I myself am a prime example of old-fashioned teaching. I teach the large introductory computer science course. Last year I started with about 400-some people and wound up passing mostly A grades to about 275 kids, and they really worked hard. But I'm standing up there, sage on stage, classical model, doing a lecture, and the only aid of technology there is that we use Brown's Echo 360, And so my real-time inking on the tablet that I walk around with is captured by Echo 360, and students can play back the lecture. And so in effect, I'm competing against myself. And I noticed that with the attrition throughout the semester, most everybody comes to class the first 2-3 weeks, and by the end of the semester, most people would much rather time shift and watch lectures to the extent that they have to at 2 o'clock in the morning when they're still awake and I'm not. So that's pretty old-fashioned. In my graphics course, which is for sophomores up through PhD students, I make more use of interactive materials, and I'll show you what one of these looks like. This is a little unit on color perception, and what I'm showing kids is what happens if you blend colored lights, bounce them off a surface that reflects and absorbs certain wavelengths of color. What is the perception? And we have about 30 of these little interactive demonstrations, and they're quite effective, but the idea that the kids would actually play with these and really examine them in depth and learn something from them, that turned out to be a pipe dream, and it's one of the things that makes me a bit cynical. I'm going to talk about a bunch of experiments that we've done over all of these years and show you a few selective pictures. This is the hypertext editing system back in 1967, already used by multiple scholars, and it led us to see that you could do really interesting things online. In 1976, Robert Scholes, how many of you remember who he was? Good, a few of you. One of the founders of MCM, among other things. He and I wrote a proposal to the NEH, one of the first times that they had received a proposal from a computer scientist. And this is the tab that a program officer sent me in the fall saying, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of NEH, and we picked 3 projects to showcase, and yours is one of them. Do you have any materials about that experiment you ran back in the mid-70s? And I said, yes, as a matter of fact. It's the only time we ever paid somebody to make an official 16mm print of the experiment, and so we're in the process of digitizing it, and I'm going to give it to them and do a little bit of a retrospective show and tell with them and the Digital Humanities Group at University of Maryland in April. Now, that poetry experiment echoes all the themes that Stephen was talking about. We created what is, I'm quite sure, the first electronic community anywhere, well before the internet, because in one of the 3 sections that Bob and his teaching assistants, Nancy Comley and Jim Catano, taught, in one of the 3 sections, all the work was done online, all the reading and all the writing, and students had to write 3 times a week. And what Bob especially appreciated and what he was very proud of is that on average, the students in the online section wrote 3 times as much as in the 2 control groups. And exactly the phenomenon that you mentioned, Stephen, that the bold did not get a chance to hog the channel, as it were, that played a big role in this online electronic community. So that system was called FRES, File Retrieval and Editing System, and it was used by a number of, especially digital humanities people around campus. It led us to think broadly about the use of electronics in education, and Brown was the first school that went big time into the adoption of what was then called workstation technology. This was the generation beyond mini computers, where you had a small mini computer in a desktop form factor with a display screen, and you could do any number of things on it. And Bob Sedgwick and a joint student we both supervised, Mark Brown and I, came up with this idea, mostly Bob's, because it came out of his algorithm animation ideas, to build an electronic classroom. Tom Deppner was very instrumental in helping us put the proposal together. Got NSF funding, we got funding from a corporation, And we built Gould Lab, which is now in the math building as a non-workstation populated place. But at that time, our vision was workstations for everybody and lots of use of online material during the conduct of a lecture. It worked for a while. There are many reasons for why it didn't ultimately survive, but it was a grand experiment, and it certainly helped put Brown on the map in terms of being in the forefront of using digital technology in adventurous ways for education. That in turn led us to get a huge grant from IBM. And the vision that we sold to IBM is shown in this 1984 BAM cover, workstations everywhere on campus. And the grant called for some 600 workstations for every faculty member who wanted one, and many graduate offices. The hardware was a little premature. It never really quite worked. So I'm afraid that too was a failed vision, but we learned a lot from doing it. This led to the creation of a research institute called IRIS, Institute for Research and Information and Scholarship, which had a central place on the Brown campus from '83 to '93. In its heyday, employed 40 people, had a multi-million-dollar budget with funders like IBM and Apple at the time. And it produced a system called Intermedia, which anticipated many of the technological capabilities of the internet and the World Wide Web. This was, again, several decades before the internet really came up. Some of that technology and knowledge was transferred to the Scholarly Technology Group. Ellie Malonis back there was a key member, and she holds some of the corporate memory of all the things that we did in those days. This is an intermediate page from George Landau's Victorian Web. It was a full-bore hypermedia system with tons of really interesting multidisciplinary information about the Victorian era entered into it for students to enlarge. And by the way, that's one of the things I want to mention. Whenever we talk about scholarly communities, it's not the act of reading so much as the act of writing, just as Stephen said. We want students to contribute to these growing corpi and add their insights and information. Well, now that's kind of where I'm going to leave the hypermedia experiments in IRIS, and I'm going to talk about a different stream, which is much more recent and which is due to Harriet Hamasi, who is sitting here and has helped to organize this series of lectures. She called me one day out of blue and said, I have this amazing artifact called the Garibaldi Panorama. Any of you heard of it? Do you know what it is? It's a magnificent piece of art. It's 270 feet long by 4.5 feet high on very fragile wallpaper, and it is gorgeous, but inaccessible. It's too fragile. It sits in an air-conditioned warehouse someplace in Cranston. And she said, I've heard that Microsoft is developing these touch tables. Wouldn't it be fun if students and faculty could interact with the Garibaldi Panorama, touching it, in effect, in its digital version, without ever having to have access to the real thing? Well, we rose to the challenge, and with a gang of students, we implemented a number of systems that became more sophisticated over time, and the latest incarnation is called Touch Art Gallery, and it's been used. Here's the Garibaldi Panorama, by the way. It's really an amazing piece of work. Massimo Riva has taught multiple courses using our system on the Garibaldi Panorama, Risorgimento in that time in Italian history, and other moving panoramas. And Sheila Bond has used it for multiple art history courses, and most recently, Stephen Lubar has used it for a stamp course, and there is a collection that should be up now. Is that right, Harriet? It is up in the John Hay on the stamps, and I'll show you what that looks like if I can get this to advance. Here's the stamp collection, or at least an image of it. So it's the stories behind the stamps. It's not just looking at the stamps and being able to pinch zoom your way to really examine them, but it's to get the historical background, the economic, the social background, and so on about what the stamp tells as a story. The picture that I'm showing now is of another use of tag. Tag was chosen by the Nobel Foundation to mount a digital exhibition that finished in Singapore and now, in fact, has moved on to Dubai. It allows you to touch. And it turns out that when you're looking at art or rare manuscripts or something like that, there's something in us, we're very tactile human beings, that makes us want to touch that stuff and to be able to interact with it in a very meaningful way. We just recently paid a visit to the Mass Historical Society. It's in Boston. You should go. They have a wonderful exhibition on Jefferson memorabilia, including drafts of the Declaration of Independence, his writings, notes on the state of Virginia, lots of notebooks on his gardens, on his architectural drawings. And it was really fun to watch people actually touch those materials without having to be worried about their fragility. So I think this is the kind of small-scale experiment that can be successful, whereas the overarching vision that I've had for so many decades of building an entire course around an electronic corpus with hypermedia trails and all the capabilities of multimedia, the ability to annotate, to have lots of metadata, that still remains to be done, and here's why. It takes an unbelievable amount of effort to author content for that medium. Composing an entire course is hard enough. Composing a textbook, in my mind, having been part of about 10 of them, is an order of magnitude more work than doing a course with a syllabus and putting some materials online. But building an entire integrated electronic online experience that you can learn from and can augment in meaningful ways is yet another order of magnitude greater, and something along the lines of building a video game. And most of you have never built a video game and aren't part of that culture. I'm also not, although I know something about it. And your average video game is done by a team, a multidisciplinary team of people working over multiple years and costs somewhere between $20 and $100 million to put together. And I think that's what it's going to take to build a true electronic course in which all the materials, secondary, tertiary, and so on, are online, and in which you have very rich interaction capabilities for the instructors as well as for the students. So it remains, I think, in the future. Meanwhile, we've got MOOCs, which are a very good experiment and are successful. We've got the kinds of experiments that my fellow panelists have talked about. So, yeah, I'm a bit of a frustrated idealist, and it's taken way longer and will take way more time and effort than I ever dreamed. But bit by bit, we're getting there.
Chica, do you want to tell everyone a little bit about your experiments in this area?
Sure. Of course, I'm sorry for my tardiness, too. So I'm Gita Pensa. I teach with the Brown University Emergency Medicine Residency. And so my students are a little different from traditional students. My students are physicians who have graduated from medical school and are doing their postgraduate training in their specialty of choice. In my case, it's in emergency medicine. So I run two different digital educational initiatives for the residency, and they're both fairly experimental. One is that I run a digital course that is meant to run in tandem with a 4-year curriculum in emergency medicine that is set by the American Board of Emergency Medicine. So I have interns through 4th-year residents that are learning the whole corpus of emergency medicine. And we have textbooks. They're very big, fat textbooks that they're supposed to work their way through over 4 years. And we have 5 hours of face-to-face lecture time every Wednesday morning, as is mandated by the board. And the rest of the time, the residents are learning pretty much on the job. So these residents over these 4 years do a lot of learning in parallel, where they're learning at the bedside and they're coming into courses on Wednesday where we're talking about something particular in the curriculum that overarches over 4 years. So last year, I started a course that we called Asynchrony, which is really meant to be asynchronous learning. And the reason that we started it was because the residents were having trouble when they were on off-service rotations, the ICU, trauma surgery, wherever. They were having trouble coming in person to their face-to-face lectures, but they are mandated to attend a certain number per year for them to graduate from one year to the next. A few years ago, the board decided that 20% of resident didactic hours could be obtained asynchronously using digital content, podcasts, a wealth of things that are available online now, especially as part of this thing called it's pretty new, it's called the Free Open Access Medical Education Movement, which is a social media-based worldwide learning initiative for teaching and learning in emergency medicine. And we can talk more about that in a minute, but that's what I draw from mostly for my course. So the board decided that 20% of their hours could be gotten digitally or asynchronously, but there had to be faculty oversight, and there had to be faculty interaction, and some sort of outcomes measures. And programs get audited every few years on these sorts of things, and your program can lose their accreditation if you're not strict enough about how these residents get their hours. So, and they didn't give any programs real instruction on what that meant. They didn't give any examples of, well, you could do this or that. They just said, these are our requirements, and you can do with that what you will, and then we'll see you when we come and audit you in a few years and tell you whether you did it right. So Brown wanted to really stick to a very strict definition. They didn't want for someone just to say, like, okay, you can listen to this podcast this week, and then we'll just sign off and say you're done. So I was tasked with this question, like, how would you approach this? Would you like to come up with something that might work? And the solution really was to build a course in Canvas that I would make a weekly module to go along with whatever we were talking about in didactics conference that week. For example, we are in the trauma module. We're 3 months. It's all trauma. We talk about it every Wednesday for 5 hours. And each week I come up with a module where I draw, and it is actually mostly because of, it's interesting that you said this, I don't create most of the content because that would be an extraordinarily large project. I'd be writing a textbook every week. But I draw from, as this open access medical education movement becomes wider and wider and wider, I draw from all of that. And I don't know if I gotta see if I can hook this up. It's too bad I didn't come earlier to see. Thank goodness I have a computer scientist who can help me.
You think we have media
I have a
services
dongle.
here,
I don't know if it's the
fortunately.
right dongle. But perhaps I can illustrate to you how that works. But that's one initiative. And the second initiative that we have is, as part of this free open access medical education movement, which is called FOAM, by the way, and right now is fairly particular to emergency medicine, but is really spreading into other specialties. We have launched an educational blog. And the residents, we have now a peer review process. We've been at it for about 7 months. And we're sort of part of this grand international social experiment, social educational experiment. And my residents now, so far, have done about 80 educational posts. And through that, we've gotten about, it's brand new out of the box.
Make no guarantees.
If not, I can maybe just get on the internet some other way and I can just show them. So for a pretty niche audience, we've had 16,000 views and we have about 6,000 unique visitors to the site. It really gets the residents very excited about creating educational content to share. There are people who internationally will comment on things, and there's this regular exchange of ideas on social media. The posts are circulated on Twitter. That's actually, Twitter is really the language that sort of connects all of these FOAM, the free open access sources, these FOAM sources. Twitter is really the conversation that happens about them. Our residents tweet regularly from lecture. Actually, across the country, in every program, didactics are on Wednesdays. And so there's this agreed upon hashtag in the emergency medicine community, and there's hashtag FOAMED is the FOAM, the tag that you tweet under for the free open access medical education movement. and hashtag EMConf is EM conference, emergency medicine conference. So all across the country on Wednesdays, programs who are active on social media, their residents will live tweet things that they're learning during conference as they happen. So if you go and scroll
Do you
through.
want to give him
Oh, yeah,
the
sure.
login?
Okay, so this is our blog, and this has been a really fun thing. I got to say that the residents are very into this, and so this is the most recent case we have. CITW is one of our featured series. It stands for Clinical Image of the Week. So residents who are in the hospital, they ask patients who agree if they have interesting physical findings or an interesting X-ray or their EKG or whatever, if they can share that, if we can share that publicly and make it part of this free open, this phone movement. And so we'll do cases like this. We publicize every week. The residents read them, the faculty read them. They comment and share. They send them on Twitter. That's sort of the surprise element. They continue reading at the end. Our Twitter account isn't working, but it actually has been. I should need to reload that. But this particular article or post has been shared. I think at this point, the last count was about 115 times.
Could you use the microphone since it's being recorded?
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
How about over here? Okay. This is better? Sorry. So every week we will have 3 or 4 posts on the blog that we share via social media. The residents enjoy learning from each other this way. The resident who's writing the post, I feel, has a lot of learning. It's sort of like reading your report in front of the class. They spend a lot of time in preparation of it. They choose things that they think are worthy of sharing, and then they go through a little peer review process where a chief resident will read it, and then a faculty person will read it and sign off on it before it kind of is released into the Twitter sphere. The fact that it's public, I think, is a real incentive for the residents to get their information right and to really produce high impact, very interesting things for the blog. They don't want really boring stuff out there. They don't want things that have been hashed out before. They're looking for some unique angles of things, and I think they're having a lot of fun with it. You can see we have our Twitter feed on the right. They tweet out their articles. They tweet out from conference. You can follow them on Twitter if you're interested in emergency medicine pearls. We also will hyperlink to other sites that provide content for some of these things. So I'll show you. So this is a post that a resident did on a procedure that we do called the central line. And he spends a lot of time sort of, talking about how things are done. And then what we'll do is, as part of this open access movement, you can, freely share what others have done. This is Scott Weingart, who's an emergency physician, who's a very big blogger in critical care, and has created lots of educational podcasts, and he's sort of the guru of a lot of critical care procedures, so we'll import that, and we'll share that within what we're doing. And that's really how we've built the digital course that we do, which is meant to parallel what's happening in Didactics Conference. So I will log in and show you that. So here we have every week right now. As I said, we're in Trauma Month. So we'll just pick one of these. It's neck and C-spine for a particular module. And what you'll see is that I hyperlink out to material that's available almost exclusively online. And if it isn't available in a source of another blog or a podcast or a video lecture, sometimes I'll incorporate e-articles from the Brown Medical Library. But for the most part, almost everything that I'm looking for is in some way, shape, or form now online in a free open access version that I can pull from. And again, here is, we sort of hyperlink through. This will be someone talking about some recent evidence. The podcast, they'll have a little blurb at the bottom, and then we can listen to the podcast for 20 minutes. And try and keep it to about an hour's worth of content for each week. And then after each of these, there's a discussion section, an online discussion section, and then a quiz. with the discussion section, the residents required to actually post something which sort of we can pull up at a later time to prove that they had interaction if we get audited for these hours. And then the quiz is really their outcomes measure, and if they pass, they get to log an hour of credit. And that's 1 hour that they don't actually have to show up and lecture for. But we find that the residents do these and they show up for as many lectures as they can. They just, some of the residents really do enjoy this format better. They like doing it on their own time. They don't have a lot of free time, so whenever they can find an hour to do something, they enjoy doing it this way. And there are a few residents that don't ever do it because they feel like they can get to lectures when they need to, and they would just rather learn in a face-to-face way. So it turns into a very individual choice, I'm finding. But we've had a lot of fun sort of creating this, and each week it's this challenge to find out how are we going to build the content into what we're making this week, what we're talking about this week. And the discussion section is actually usually a lot of fun too. We draw other faculty into it, and see if it's not my area of expertise, I'll draw somebody else who's more of a trauma, someone who's doing research in trauma, someone who's doing research in sepsis, or whatever it is that we're talking about that week. I sort of try and pull them in and engage them as well to answer whatever questions come up. Yep.
Thank you so much to all the panelists. I'd like to just follow up with some questions drawn, in part I pre-circulated some questions, but also drawn, some of which were already addressed in the presentations, but also drawn from what I was hearing here. So Stephen, I wanted to return to something you said about how teaching online changed how you prepared your material and how you prepared to teach it. And in a sense, I was thinking the same thing as I was listening to you, Geeta, about how, in a sense, and maybe this is true about teaching already, but it seems all the more true here, a major curatorial role that you're playing in a way that is much less true, I think, in a traditional classroom. So those are just observations, but I'm wondering if the panelists in general would want to reflect a little bit on how these kinds of tools have changed how you prepare and teach a course. And it's really open to anyone.
So when I was redesigning the class, something that kind of surprised me, and I should have thought that way, is that when you start re-optimizing, thinking about the new technology, you also realize that you were doing things wrong with the previous technology. So the lessons you derive from trying to do the best you can with the new technology, then it changes you even how you lecture with a chalk, okay? So I think that was a surprising thing to me, that it changed how I saw the whole class, not only how I saw the video. And that was my first and my most important takeaway from the whole experience.
Yeah, Stephen, you said something similar, that you actually changed how you teach your non-online course as a result of your online course.
Yeah, I have been using Canvas to record the planning of the class in advance. So a typical Canvas class for me would have 3 weekly units in it, in which I write a little paragraph explaining what the goals of that class are going to be. And I think I had those in the back of my mind before, but it was communicated on mimeograph sheets in a kind of shorthand, like Fairy Queen, Book 3, Cantos 1 to 3, and that was all I would say on the syllabus. Now I write a little paragraph about what's going on in those cantos and asking questions of the students what we're going to study about that.
Thank you. Geeta, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, for me, this is a totally different way of teaching. And probably the biggest change for me has been how much I draw from social media now. I was not on Twitter before. I was not really into social media, except I had a Facebook account, that's it. But now I regularly mine Twitter for connections to what I'm looking for. I search Twitter. And I've actually made a lot of interesting professional social connections through social media. And sometimes I can throw out a question on Twitter like, hey, does anyone have a resource on XYZ? And they'll come back to me and say, oh yeah, look here, this is where it is. And then I can find what I want better. It's been really interesting, and I get to be creative each week, and writing the narrative is actually a lot of fun. And so for me, this is a very big difference. Medical education is really very traditional. So to sort of break out of that mold and try something different has been a lot of fun.
And I think there's a certain irony that our computer scientist seems to have remained most staunchly connected to the most traditional forms, at least in his large lecture class, and in some ways rejected some of these tools, actually, or found them to be not as satisfying or as good as some of the traditional methods. I wonder if you want to say a little bit more about that.
Well, I'm under no illusion that lectures are the primary means by which students learn. Certainly not in my field. It's the practice that counts. And the best that I can hope is to motivate them. I have less and less interactive stuff in the introductory course because I find that students don't pay that much attention, don't seem to value them all that much, and they just as soon get on with the next topic, which disappoints me, but it's a fact. The biggest disappointment is that these much more sophisticated interactives that I use for the graphics course, some of which have taken multiple weeks, if not longer, to develop, are not sufficiently attractive that the kids want to play with them. And I've never understood why that is. They don't really understand it either. They've told me, well, your notes are sufficiently detailed, I can do the assignments without having to run them, and that just will take extra time. So I think your use of material that you find on the web that is relevant to you is very exciting. And I do trawl the web to see if there are interesting illustrations of what I'm talking about, but it's harder in my area to find stuff that I think is really a useful adjunct. I can't draw any conclusions from that small sample. I think your sample is much more relevant for this audience.
Thank you. Pedro, when you were speaking, you were talking about one of the challenges, at least as I think you, of using these new technologies, if I understood what you were saying, was actually the act of sort of reaffirming the use of digital technology in our lives. Is that, did I have you right? Is that what you were saying, that one of the possibilities here is that there are some of the more traditional forms of learning that are attractive or that have some merit in some ways, or you were at least posing the question that in some ways this could be a downside?
Yes,
Is that right? Did I have you right?
I worry about the downside of, there may be a very clear short-run benefit in that you make learning easier, but you may not spend so much time teaching how to learn because you made it so easier. So if you could implant a chip automatically, we would deprive the people of the capacity to learn by themselves. No? So that was an extreme example, but
Right.
but I worry a little about those trade-offs, the very short-run benefit because you made the class so much more entertaining and better, but I'm afraid about a little, not very afraid, a little afraid of losing the training in terms of how you learn in a difficult way.
I'm wondering if our other panelists would like to comment on that. Is that something you've seen happen in your classes, or a concern that you share in any way, or are the positive trade-offs enough that one kind of learning is supplanted or traded for another? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's something different about real time. If you have an online discussion, it may have a window of 36 hours. So that isn't quite the same kind of a challenge of having students all responding to something at the same time, whether it's in person or online.
Did you want to say something, Andy?
No.
Okay. One thing I've heard from colleagues occasionally who've worked in this area that I don't think I've heard any of you say is a concern about their own time. That, particularly Stephen in fully online courses, but Gita, this may also be true in what you were talking about. And Andy, also, I think you kind of hinted at this when you were talking about the immensity of really doing this right. That it's actually tremendously time-consuming. And I'm wondering how, Stephen, starting with you, I'm working in the fully online capacity where students all are writing in and you're presumably feeling required, as perhaps you should, to respond to all of that writing, how you felt it compared to the workload of a regular class or of a more traditional class.
I think they're comparable. The big difference was the preparation of the class in advance, and that was, it was a mini textbook, really.
Exactly.
Just an enormous investment of time. Once the discussions get going, they're self-regulating, the students are responding to one another, and my own comments, I think, are probably more minimal than they are to individually submitted student papers, because so much of what I would have said has already been said.
So the investment being upfront.
Yeah.
Yeah, Andy.
Yeah, I want to echo that very strongly. Bob Scholes and his 2 graduate teaching assistants spent something like 6 months building the corpus. It was huge by the time the students got access to it, and then it became much larger still because of their writings and the critiques of the instructors on their critiques, but the upfront investment is exactly what I was speaking to. If you want to do this in a serious way and really plan it out, it's a huge amount of time, and it amazes me that you're able to do that on a week-by-week basis during the conduct of the course. I don't have the the guts to do that.
It really is because I can draw from all these other media. And if there were not this open access medical education movement, and it's specific right now to emergency medicine, but there are 300 professional, very high quality blogs and there are several that are run by other residencies. I draw from other residencies, they draw from our stuff. So where we have, very basic, there are medical student level ones, there are much more sophisticated ones, there are research ones, and only because there has been this proliferation of that kind of content is the only reason that I can do this on a weekly basis. The weeks where there are topics that aren't written about or spoken about or lectured on quite as often because they're not really as fun or sexy as the airway or trauma or whatever. If we're talking about hematology, there's really not that much out there. So when I have to fill in the blanks for things or have them draw from, online texts or things like that, but some weeks are easier than other weeks.
Pedro, do you want to speak to that in the flipped format? Because I think I've heard that from faculty too about the sort of what you have to put in advance versus how much time it takes during the semester.
Yes, when we flipped the classroom, we had a year of work before the class before we taught the class. There was the issue of teaching the new TAs, developing all the new exercises, all the problems, the videos. So there was a big starting cost. Then that gets used several years or in several sections, so that helps. So there is an issue of scale. What would be great is to have more materials we could download. They will be public available. I think we are not there yet. There are not enough videos that we can just link that will have the right exercise for our class. But I guess at some point we are going to have that, and I guess at some point we will have the facility to just go and record the video. The videos are like Khan Academy videos. You just see the writing. No? So it will be easy to have a facility where we go. You don't need to worry about having the right software, the cables being connected or anything, the microphone making noise, because you discover that. You record the whole video and then you realize that there was a noise and you have to do it again and again. So there are things that can lower the beginning, the cost that you have to pay at the beginning.
Thank you. Andy?
I wanted to mention that there is a little subfield of instructional technology that has dealt extensively with what's called tutored video, where they deal exactly with the problem you mentioned, that you can start and stop and replay a video, but you can't get somebody to answer a question. Well, what the tutored video movement does is they make a graduate student instructor or somebody from the field available to a group of students studying remotely so that the video can be paused, the question can be posed and answered, and then you roll forward again. And that seems to be a good combination of the best of video and the best of live lectures with a competent instructor.
I wonder if we could turn to the topic of student learning outcomes. Stephen, you spoke about this a little bit in the flattening access for the bold student who always speaks out in class and the quiet student who's less likely to do so in the way the online version allows people all access point to all people. I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about other kinds of student outcomes. Pedro, you said students were very enthusiastic in course evaluations. How about in test results, assessments? You said office hours. How do you know your students are learning better, differently, the same? And what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we know the first time we did this, we have a treatment and a control. So we have a treatment with a usual standard format and a control with the new problem-solving sessions and the videos. The exams were not totally comparable due to the design, so we didn't find large differences in performance during exams. There was a big difference in satisfaction in terms of teaching evaluations. More importantly, people in the treatment, in the new design, were more likely to take economic classes after. So they liked economics better. And so we were very happy with that. That's what we see. We don't have, in our experiment, we didn't have enough data to answer this issue of who benefit the most from the new design. So I cannot say, there is some research on this about whether a certain set of the students tend to benefit from this more or less than others. I don't have data to answer to that very important question. No? But the teaching evaluations improved significantly.
Thank you. Gita, do you want to speak to that at all, the sort of comparative outcome question?
Well, it's very difficult for us. We didn't have, it's not a true experiment per se. And like I said, they're learning these things simultaneously at the bedside and in other didactics, and we have 4 levels of learners. The closest we've come is having some students watch a video of, sort of a blog post with a video attached of a certain procedure, and then the other residents reading it and looking at the static pictures, which is how we would normally teach it before you would actually, have someone demonstrate it on a mannequin. And clearly the the young doctors who had watched the video clearly knew what they were doing sooner than the residents who had just read and come in unprepared. But I don't, otherwise in terms of, I measure outcomes just with their quizzes each week, but really the only feedback I have is just really the residents' opinions, and they're very favorable about the course. They like it. They certainly like having that option to learn things and to go back and to find them. One other thing that's been sort of turning to the blog that has been helpful, and again, I can't say whether it's truly helping outcomes, but it's certainly making bedside teaching a little speedier and more efficient, is this notion of just-in-time teaching, which is becoming much more in vogue in medicine and bedside teaching, which is when if you have a medical student or a resident with you and a particular case presents itself, and you want to teach them about a topic, but you only have, you've got the 5 minutes before you go into the patient's room, I could go through my spiel on neonatal fever 1,000 times, or I could say, here's this, these are my teaching points on it. You hold my phone, you watch this for 2 minutes, I'm gonna come back. And then we're gonna talk about the finer points, and then we're gonna go into the room. Or if you're about to do a spinal tap, we pull up now routinely, we have a procedure video on the whole article on spinal taps that will show medical students and say, okay, you watch these videos, XYZ, then we're gonna go in, and now you have, it's almost in this sort of flipped classroom kind of way, except it's just-in-time teaching. It's very spontaneous teaching. But we rely on a digital component and say, okay, watch this, and then we're gonna go in, and we're gonna do that spinal tap together.
That's fascinating. That's almost the opposite of the, online teaching takes longer. In your world, what I'm hearing is you get something else done while the students do that, right? And you don't have to repeat the same lecture.
Check something else and then come back. Okay, did you watch that? All right, great, let's go. So, but it'll be interesting if we can figure out a way to really get data on it. But I'm not sure that would be an easy thing to do.
Stephen, I wonder if you could qualitatively say anything about the students writing, not just that more students are interacting, but do you see a difference in the, I mean, I assume at some level having students write while traveling changes even the content of what they're writing about in a course on travel writing. But I'm wondering if you see other outcomes that you could speak to, or is it just a different mode?
I haven't done it enough to truly to be able to say whether there's a qualitative difference. There's a technological difference in that online you're able to share images, videos, music much more freely than you could with written work. So you get a different kind of document that emerges from the writing process. But I haven't done it enough. And if students take a writing course, it's because they want to. They always love it. So
Right. Fair point. Andy, did you want to add anything to that? So I have one other question, and then I'm going to open it so you guys start thinking about what your questions are going to be. But I wanted to ask one other question myself before I opened it up, which is, maybe this is to Stephen, but I would open it up to everybody. What would you say to a parent or a student about the value of a fully online course for their Brown education? In other words, one of the things I hear sometimes is, well, why would I take an online course at Brown? I'm here for the on-campus, in-class interactive experience. And Andy, you said, interestingly, I found that as the semester goes on, more and more students are going to the video.
Or not at all.
Or not at all, right. Different kind of problem. So I wonder if perhaps the two of you, but also others on the panel, would want to reflect on how you would answer that question.
well, are you talking about a fully online class on campus
I
during
am.
the?
Well,
yeah.
we actually haven't yet offered a
Right.
fully online class during the regular semester, although Brown students can get credit for the summer and soon-to-be winter session courses that are fully online. And I think we might offer one course very soon that's fully online during the semester, but it will be a canary in the coal mine, so.
Yeah, I mean, I would not offer this class totally online during the semester. I'd have at least one weekly campus-based meeting. But for me, it's just what I said before, that the writing laboratory that the online platform provides is simply a better means of exchange in a community of writers than meeting once or twice weekly to exchange documents.
So maybe it depends somewhat on the course,
On the
the kind
content,
of course,
right.
yeah. Andy, do you want to speak anything to that, given your point about
I
dwindling
don't have
numbers?
experience with online courses. I've sampled some. I think they're interesting, and certainly for asynchronous learning, they're terrific. But I think it's hard to beat a in-person experience where during the course of the classroom you can really connect. Now, being back in cynic mode, the number of times that actually happens, even in a course where there are 30 or 40 students only, is relatively small. And students do vote with their feet, even with the online courses. And in mine, they start disappearing, and it's not an uncommon phenomenon. If you have in-class exams, it's a little different, but I don't give exams or quizzes. So it's all dependent on the written work. And many of them feel that the notes are adequate and they can do the written work without benefit of lectures or any other form of instruction.
Thank you. Geeta, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I really can't. It would not, really would not be possible in medicine to have a fully online, I mean, you need to have in-person experience with the patients. If it were just a choice between these didactics that we have on Wednesdays versus a fully online course, I don't know. We'd have to think about that because we get so much interaction with them at the bedside otherwise. There are some residencies that are replacing 1 hour a week with asynchronous learning. We have not made that movement yet. We're still doing 5 hours, and then we offer this as an option that the residents do often take advantage of. But I really can't speak to how we would do an exclusively online course.
So one of my own moments of education about online learning was a visit a couple of us took to the medical school to hear about online education that's been taking place there, and I was quite struck by the number of students who I heard about who listened to all the lectures online at the medical student stage at hyperspeed. which made me a little nervous
Oh.
as a future patient, but while doing other tasks, jogging.
There is some data on that at the medical school level, actually. You know, Stanford's really sort of very, very forward thinking in terms of how changing medical education, making medical education more digital. And they did have a study where of Stanford medical students, they noticed that their lecture attendance, when they adopted a flipped classroom model, and they put their very basic medical lectures on video. There wasn't the option to come to class to hear that particular lecture. You could only come in this sort of flipped classroom model where the lecture was then going to take off. And they noticed that their lecture attendance skyrocketed. And so, I mean, it's a very motivated group of students, and if they don't, there's that added pressure of, if they don't learn it, then someone's going to die. So, I think that maybe that's a little, maybe they're more, motivated than other groups might be, but they're finding ones that in-person lecture attendance actually went up.
Interesting. So I'd like to open this up to folks in the room who want to ask questions of our panelists. We actually, it looks like we don't have mics for this, so you can yell, or I can repeat your question, or you can come up and use this one if you want. So is there someone in the room who wants to start this off with a question to anyone?
I was wondering what you feel the future holds for teaching with new emerging technologies like virtual reality and augmented reality.
Could everybody hear the question? The future with virtual or augmented reality, what the future holds for that?
I've done a bunch of work in virtual reality. Brown has unusually good instrumentation for virtual reality, by the way. The latest thing is called the YURT Ultimate Reality Theater. It's a recursive acronym. And it provides a surround immersive experience with 100 million pixels of resolution. So you can display amazingly detailed stuff in there. Jim Head is one of the faculty members who's used it extensively, both the old cave and this new one, for Martian exploration, because you can get a sense of what it would be like to stand on the surface of Mars or drive a rover or something like that. It's been used by John Cayley for electronic writing, cave writing it's called, and it's a really neat course, very multidisciplinary and engaging. So I'm absolutely confident that there will be in the future courses that will do their laboratory work, and it could be a huge part of the course in virtual environments, especially when you don't have to go all the way to 180 George Street, but you can put on some headgear, which is going to come out this year for gaming primarily, but it will certainly be used for providing educational experiences. Here too, the cynic part of me says it's very easy to provide a nice environment to walk through, but doing true instructional design that has deep learning associated with it, that builds on everything you can do in a virtual environment, is way, way harder than the flashy stuff that the game community will be enjoying this year already. So big future, but it will take this kind of exponential to develop really worthwhile content.
The closest that we're coming right now is simulation in medicine, and we at the Sim Center with the medical school, it's certainly not a virtual reality, although I can dream about what sort of awesome things we could do with that. But the mannequins are quite sophisticated, and once a month the residents spend 4 hours over there where we just put them through with these amazing simulation mannequins. We put them through their paces with various cases, and they're all, they're all, the wizard is behind the curtain for all of them. There's always instructors sort of talking for the patient or presenting them, the vital signs or saying what's happening. But the mannequins are fairly lifelike, and the monitors are real, and when they perform interventions on the mannequins, they get sort of realistic responses to them. But you could dream about what could happen in a virtual reality setting.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Sure. So I know there's been some anxiety just sort of hearing folks talking about the compromises or whether the educational process is being compromised in some way or maybe diminished by sort of leaning on some of these digital technologies. But I'm wondering, to what extent is that also the vernacular that the students are coming in with? In other words, to what extent is video, is media, especially media in a sort of accessible, instantaneous kind of way, something that's almost an expectation that students are kind of coming into the classroom with already? And to what extent is a lot of us sort of responding to that rather than, I guess, trying to come up with a novel solution?
I'd sort of like to say something about that because I know a lot of young humanities concentrators, and I keep in touch with some of them as they go out into the world. Almost all of them, if they're not doing Teach for America, the rest are writing for some kind of online publication. And I think that that's a world that's much more visible to them than it is to me. I was sitting at home this afternoon with my 31-year-old son, and he turned on The New Yorker online on television. I didn't know that existed. There are these beautiful visual essays, just like New Yorker essays, but with pictures. I had no idea that those were there. So I think that generational connection is very important, and we should get in touch with it. And another aspect of this is that, for me as a scholar of early literatures, the best scholarly resources are now online. They simply are. And if you're teaching in whole or in part with an online platform, you can put your students in direct contact with those resources in a meaningful way. And our own library website makes that a lot easier than it used to be. So you can link up to the resources of the library website through your Canvas website.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on your question, many students in high schools, at least in affluent high schools, are given computers. A lot of their work is in high schools already online, or they're doing some aspect of this in some ways. So they come in, forget what they're doing in their free time. They come in already used to learning in these ways. And so I think that's a really relevant question for education at the university level going forward. But it then also does raise that question about campus learning in a place like Brown, where the interactive between professor and student is still so valued, obviously, and important. Anyone else want to weigh in on that particular issue?
For us, it was absolutely a demand for the residents. They had been clamoring for a couple of years to have some sort of a digital instruction option. And the blog, too, they'd been asking for a couple of years. They wanted to join this movement, and they really just thought it'd be a lot of fun, learning and fun. And we were resisting for a couple of years. There were a lot of different reasons. Of faculty, there are very few faculty that are really into this at all right now. So I'm sort of I'm a convert, but there's really, there's no zealot like a convert. Now that I'm into it, I think it's great. But the residents were definitely the driving force, and we had our concerns with the social media aspect of it because we're in healthcare. There are lots of HIPAA concerns and private privacy issues and things like that. But we've done pretty extensive social media training with the residents, and they've sort of had this hammered into them, and into their brains about the importance of minding all of that. And we have now our levels of review, so hopefully we'll, knock wood, because that would pretty much shut us down in a heartbeat, but hopefully we'll be okay. But absolutely, I really none of the faculty knew a thing about this until the residents came in and started saying, we're reading this anyway. Actually, there was a study before the board okayed for the residents to get some of these hours asynchronously. There was a study that showed 95% of the however many 500 residents that they'd surveyed in emergency medicine were already using these blogs and podcasts and these professional sites. They were already using them on a weekly basis for instruction without any faculty guidance or, their version of asking the question was they'd ask, in the comment section, they'd pose a question, and then whoever would author it would hopefully get back to them. So we're coming around to it, but the cart is definitely leading the horse here.
Harriet?
You've talked about the changes that you experience as faculty in the classroom or out of the classroom. What do you think the changing role or responsibility of the students is. And Andy, I would ask you to begin because I think we've heard you talk about, even though you haven't said it specifically, that students have a different level of responsibility if they're not coming to class.
In my courses, their responsibility is to do high-quality assignments. And if they can do that completely bypassing me, so be it. And I have to admit, when we do the final project demonstrations in my graphics course, I see kids doing beautiful work that I don't recognize, even though there are only 50, 60 people in the course. They never came to class. They were completely self-sufficient. And I have a hard time with that. But ultimately, if they do the work and it's high-quality work, which it is, then I have to be satisfied that at least we provided a good platform for learning, even though it completely excludes me.
Is there anyone else who wants to weigh in on the responsibility of students in this kind of context? Pedro?
Yeah, I think maybe more in the social sciences, but many of the classes have like a discussion component or some group working component, and if a student is not coming to class, not doing the homework, is hurting the whole class. So I think there is a big social responsibility there from each student of doing their part, because in a way they are here to learn from each other as well, and if they are not coming prepared, they are hurting the whole class. So I think it's a big student responsibility in an econ class, at least, because given how it's taught, no? And if we move more towards having discussions, so the goal, I think, after all this redesigning, my final goal is like an econ class, even at the basic level, should look much more like other social sciences or the humanities, in which there is much more discussion, and try to learn a lot of the tools before and then have an intelligent discussion about social problems using the tools that we are seeing. And if they didn't learn the tools, how can we have an intelligent discussion? So, big responsibility.
I'm open to hearing other questions. Also, if there is anyone in the audience who has experimented with certain digital or online technologies who wants to share that in the room, that would be welcome as well. So if anyone has an experience to share. I have not myself taught in this way, but I have a colleague in one of my departments who did a fascinating digital project, but was really combining online with in class in a very different kind of way, which is after studying the topic of the course for the whole semester, he had the students update the Wikipedia page on that subject, and went through the process with them of doing that, and then watching other people change what they had written, often with incorrect information. And that was a very powerful kind of lesson, I think, of a totally different kind, right, about how knowledge is constituted and the role of the student as a participant, as a creator of knowledge, going back to something Andy said about writing. So I think and that's just one of any number of examples I can think of that I've heard of folks doing really interesting things where the course might be a more standard traditional course, but where it's tapped into some of digital technology in one form or another to lead to an interesting learning outcome. So, are there other questions or examples anyone wants to offer? I think you're going to have to shut.
What struck me was, I think that there are people who use, and they've got a lot of money, they've got a lot of resources, and they put a lot of multimedia in the materials they create, and they're big textbook publishers, and they're often doing things for technical training. I mean, other people may know more about this than me. This is kind of just from having read things or having something float by my horizon. So what I think is kind of interesting is that there is some of the things that, for example, Intermedia was trying to do, not at the level of the English class, but at the level of the technologies and the links and things like that. They're there. They're just teaching HVAC or home economics for people who, and they're being sold to large numbers of people. So there is that going on. But at the same time, some of the things that we use have become resources that are available. But I was intrigued by this thought of like how much time it takes to put it all together, which is absolutely true. But how there are other people who've been quietly doing it, except they're doing it in this other domain. And perhaps it's easier for them because of that domain. The domain itself may lend itself more to that because maybe everybody teaches HVAC the same way. Whereas we don't teach.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is that the subjects that involve more fact and skill acquisition and less interpretation are easier to put into this new format. And particularly when there is money for the development, you get two forces working together to make it happen. Can I tell a story for a
Please,
couple of
yes.
minutes?
Yes, I think you can. We have about 5 minutes left, so unless somebody's dying to respond in another way. Please, a story.
When this whole online thing was starting to gather some momentum, and there was a lot of talk about universities going digital, and a lot of money was pouring into it, and various universities, including Brown, were flirting with the idea of being invested in or investing in these new technologies. It occurred to me that what we ought to do is try to get really big funding for some exemplar courses that could serve as examples and prototypes for what would be doable, and that would be as influential in their respective fields as Samuelson has been in economics and various textbooks in calculus. And you know, when you say Thomas, everybody knows who Thomas is in the math and engineering biz, because that book really helped solidify the way in which calculus was taught for decades, and in many ways still is today. And probably Samuelson and its successors were equally influential. So I talked to the head of National Science Foundation about this idea of gathering, say, on the order of a fund of $100 million over a number of years and dispersing it to these multidisciplinary groups that would be driven by a subject matter expert, typically an academic, but with all the other resources like graphic designers, web designers, instructional designers working with the content expert to produce the one really definitive electronic course / electronic textbook. Unfortunately, I preached all this during the dot-com bubble, which, as we all know, in all too short a time was followed by the dot-bomb. And so we gathered a little bit of money, but we never really got the project underway. I still think that's the way to do it. Get the Thomases and the Samuelsons and the other thought leaders of a number of different subject areas to create an exemplar course with a huge amount of planning and production that would go into building the corpus, and let that serve as an example to motivate other people to make derivatives, to make contributions to it, and so on. I think that's the scale at which we have to think, but I can't find any resonance with that idea.
Ravi.
Just a quick comment to your question why it's not going to replace some of the outstanding teaching that occurs at Brown. One of the software packages that we rolled out to campus that talks to your question, which is lynda.com. And if you have not seen how well developed the courses are on lynda.com, which is available to all of the faculty, staff, and students, free to use, I encourage you to check it out. You may really like the quality of the courses, from programming to leadership to diversity to conflict resolution. There are courses, there are about 3,000 different courses on a variety of topics. And again, they're not too deep, but they are very useful.
Thank you. So I think at this time, I really want to thank our 4 panelists for taking the time to share their experiences with us. So first, a round of applause to the panelists. Thank you so much. There is a reception, I believe, behind this auditorium, so we hope you'll stay and join us for that. And I'd really like to encourage you to come participate in this series as we roll forward. There'll be, I believe, at least 2 more events in the series over the course of this semester. The dates and titles are not yet available, but we will be definitely sending out information about that as the semester rolls forward. So thanks again to the panelists and to all of you for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at the reception. Thank you.
Thank you.